some detailed critical interrogation of the way in which the world gets interpreted from all manner of different perspectives. And so it's in that tradition that very happy tonight to be able to host Hamid Dabashi, who comes to us from Columbia University, who's deeply knowledgeable about Islam and what is happening in Iran, Egypt, and many other parts of the world. He is the Kevorkian Professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, written on subjects ranging from Iranian studies, medieval and modern Islam, comparative literature to world cinema and philosophy of art. His books include Authority in Islam, published in 1989, Theology of Discontent, 1993, Staging a Revolution, The Art of Persuasion, The Islamic Republic of Iran, 2000, Iran, People Interrupted, and Post-Orientalism, Knowledge and Power in Time of Terror. And tonight we're going to be discussing the new book. Is it actually out yet, or is it? No. Not actually out yet. It's about to see the light of day, the Arab Spring, the end of post-colonialism. And we're very happy that Anthony Alexandrini can join us as a discussant. He's about to be indoctrinated by joining the seminar in the Center for Place, Culture and Politics. So if you listen to him next year, he'll be talking an entirely different language from what he's saying now. He is Associate Professor of English at Kingsborough Community College and an affiliate faculty member of the Middle Eastern American Center at the Kennedy Graduate Center. Currently a Mellon Faculty Fellow of Committee on Globalization and Social Change. His work focuses on post-colonial literature and theory, and the connection between Middle Eastern literature and culture and post-colonial studies, with a particular focus on the relationship between aesthetics and politics. I thought the format it would be helpful if Hamid could start off and talk a little bit about the main theses that are being presented in this book. He starts off with comparing this moment in Middle East, Egypt, with 1848. We might talk a little bit about that comparison. Of course, most famously, that period around 1848 was written about by Marx, who talked about the whole problem of trying to interpret the world in terms of past poetry, and that we had to create a poetry of the future. And to the degree that I've managed to read, I confess I haven't read all of it, but I've read much of it. It seems to me that one of your ambitions is to try to create a new interpretive framework, a new poetry to understand a world that is in radical transformation. And so that this opportunity to hear that theme, I think, is very important for us. And then after you spend maybe half an hour or so talking about it, I'll ask Anthony to make some critical commentary. We'll have a little bit back and forth. I may be inspired to intervene a bit myself, we'll see. And then open it up to all of you. So with that, let me welcome Hamid Dabashi, and thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Professor Harvey. It's a great privilege to be here. I am, by extension, also a student of Professor Harvey via internet, and checking my first volume of The Capital with his. And thank you for coming. In fact, the first comparison now that comes to my mind is not 1848, it's actually 1941. 1941, 7th of December, John Dewey was invited to give a talk at Cooper Union, and hundreds, according to Professor Diggins, had gathered at Cooper Union because that was the day that Pearl Harbor had happened. And obviously everybody was expecting Professor Dewey to say something about Pearl Harbor, and he began by saying, I have nothing to say about what happened to that, because he had regretted having said something about World War I. And he gave some shares some thought as to why is it that he should not rush into saying something about the current events as a philosopher. In my Arab Spring, I'm afraid I have entirely the opposite proclivity, meaning that this is a book that comes out of deep commitment and concern and belonging, sense of belonging to this revolutionary moment. And I was just sharing with Professor Hardy in his office that contrary to what anthropologists call participant observer, I am not an observer of the Arab revolutions, I'm a participant. And my book is, as I say so in the book itself, is joining people in Tahrir Square and saying, Ash'ab Yurīd Islam al-Islam, people demand the overthrow of the regime, but in my own particular way, which is writing this book. Now, that obviously is a whole different hermeneutic spin on how we see things. I'm not, the interlocutor of the book is not, as usually happens on these occasions, a fictive white man in North America or Western Europe to whom I'm trying to explain what happened in Egypt. My interlocutors are actually people in Tahrir Square, in Manama, in Syria, in North Africa, in Iran, the Arab world, etc. So all the excitement, all the anxieties, all the missteps, all the exaggerations, all the cautions, etc., that is with us, obviously is embedded in the book, in every page of the book. As you know, the position of the left, among which I consider myself, has been quite ambiguous about these Arab revolutions. They're very concerned and cautious that, in fact, a combination, a bizarre combination of United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Cooperation Council, etc., are trying to, or have already, some believe, kidnapped this revolution. And Syria, in particular, has become the battleground of these sorts of forces with Russia, China, Iran on one side, and the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States on the other. Is a proxy war that is happening. I'm perfectly aware and wary of all of these forces and facts, but nevertheless, with the proverbial not throwing baby in the bathwater, I do see the bathwater, but I do believe that we are facing a fundamental seismic change in the very political DNA of the region that we have to watch carefully. So the book is a combination of deep engagement with day-to-day events as they have happened over the past year and a half, and so some of the chapters are site-specific. For example, what was happening in Libya, what were the forces, etc. Some of them are more, long durée issues such as labor migration, race, gender, class in the region. And a couple of the major ideas that I have introduced and worked with in the book. One of them, for example, is the idea of open-ended revolution rather than a total revolution. That because the book very much is under the shadow of Hannah Arendt, book on the revolution and her specific distinction between the French and the American Revolution, I'm very much influenced by that thinking, and as a result, my thoughts are drawn not toward the political regime, but toward the public space, and how public space is being defined, cultivated, and reconsidered. Sort of looking at Tahrir Square as a reappropriation of a public space. The idea of the open-ended revolution also, I use a literary factor apropos of poetics, that these revolutions are unfolding more like a Bakhtinian novel rather than a Homeric epic. We are not looking for any new Gamal Abdel Nasser, a new Mossadegh, or a new Gandhi, even to emerge from these revolutions, but day to day, the next page, you don't know what exactly is going to happen. The other idea that I developed is the notion of delayed defiance, by which I mean the moment of the post-colonial was supposed to be the moment of liberation, when colonialism sort of nominally ended and European colonizers packed and left. These sorts of revolts for liberty, justice, and democracy was supposed to take place, but there has been a delayed period. That period we have covered under the rubric of post-coloniality, as you know. And that post-coloniality I identify with the modus operandi of the production of three kinds of ideology: anti-colonial nationalism, third world socialism, and militant political Islamism over the last, say, 200 years or so, since the French and British colonial interests in North Africa and the Middle East. That particular condition of post-coloniality I also propose as a mode of ideology production has concluded, has ended. That is, I look at the figure of Muammar Gaddafi running for his life in the deserts of Libya as a post-colonial officer, so sort of running to a cul-de-sac. So these are some of the ideas with which I play, and also there's lots of attention to the art and literature and poetry of the Arab world prior to the rise of the Arab Spring. Particularly, I'm interested in the works of filmmakers like Elias Suleiman, and the non-linear conception of unfolding dramas. In fact, the piece that I just finished for Al Jazeera is coming out tomorrow, or maybe it's already out, is a reading of non-linear disposition of this unfolding. Non-linear meaning that this whole notion of domino effect, that Ben Ali fell in Tunisia, then Mubarak, and then Gaddafi, and then Ali Abdullah Saleh, that kind of linearity actually doesn't work and doesn't mean anything. The fact that, for example, Mubarak is no longer in power in Egypt doesn't mean that the revolution is over, and thus the idea of open-ended revolution. As you know, Omar Suleiman is the man in charge of his security. I was just running for, until yesterday, was running for presidency. And there's also fear of Islamism, Muslim Brotherhood coming and taking over. I don't have that fear, precisely because I trust in the audacity and veracity of this public space. And as a result, I argue that these unfoldings are more non-linear. And in fact, if our attention is exclusively on the chopping off of the head, for example, right now, of the Syrian regime in Bashar al-Assad, that will limit the calculus of the revolutionary momentum, because people are satisfied, okay, Bashar al-Assad is gone now, at the end of the revolution, let's go home, shake hands, and be happy. Whereas I think the actual calculus which is in operation, namely embedded in the word, in the slogan, people demand the overthrow of the regime. That regime is not only regime, political regime, also regime of knowledge, is also a regime of knowledge production. Because of that, I'm also interested in, because ever since I heard the word Middle East, I come with rashes every time I hear the Middle East. I argue for what one of the chapters is called liberation geography, kind of reimagining the geography of the region. A reimagination which is predicated on fact of labor migrations, that are roaming the globe from one end to another, labor chasing after capital, capital dodging, going after cheap labor. That circularity has, of course, overshadowed the fictive boundaries of east, west, north, south, and so forth. And I think in the moment of the Arab Spring, we're also witness to the dismantling of this imaginative geography. Particularly, I even question and interrogate the word Arab Spring, because there are many things happening in sub-Saharan Africa, from Djibouti to Somalia, that are usually not registered, to Zimbabwe, for example. In Zimbabwe, a group of people gathered to watch a video of Tahrir Square and were arrested, harassed, and so forth. There are labor unrest, there are demonstrations on the model of Tahrir Square in Djibouti, in many other parts of Africa, but they don't usually register, because when you say Arab Spring, then of course Africa is not part of it. I also connected to similar uprisings in Iran, happened in 2009, and I also connected to the repressed desire of places like Iraq, that they would have liked to have joined the Arab Spring and overthrew their own regime by their own hands, but of course they have been deprived of that possibility. So in short, it's a the book is a combination of a long summer, as I just told Professor Harvey, reflection, sitting and thinking, and gathering all my years of experience and thinking and travels and reading and writing in the Arab and Muslim world, in one sustained sort of began writing A and then finished Z, and sent it off to my, God bless her soul, editor in London. And she cut, I wrote 2.5 times what I was supposed to write. And she cut it into shape, and that's the story. That's me.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's an honor to be up here in this, between the two eminence. No, and it's a wonderful, I mean, it's wonderful to have the opportunity to read this. And one thing, I mean, it wasn't something that came up explicitly, but it would be interesting to me to think about the trajectory between your previous book, which people know is a book called Brown Skin, White Masks, which was very much about what you called kind of comfort of intellectuals. And in some ways, this feels like the, if that was the, pessimism of the intellect side of things, this is the sort of optimism of the will side of things. So it was interesting to me to think about those two together. And, of course, those comfort of intellectuals are still functioning. They haven't disappeared. So, I mean, one question would be, to think those things together. The possibility of that kind of backlash. I mean, I have just a few things. I'm sure a lot of people have a lot that they want to ask, so I'll be brief. Yes. One has to do with the subtitle of the book, which again sort of came up in your remarks, but this question of, as you call it, the end of post-colonialism, and how that functions. And it sort of struck me that one of the ways you talk about that, and one of the ways that you've talked about it already, is kind of the role of aesthetics, and how aesthetic, or kind of aesthetic revolution, has kind of overtaken kind of more ideological forms of politics, or forms of politics as ideology. So I would love to hear more about that. You mentioned this was sort of literary and aesthetic kind of comparisons with the book, but sort of thinking about Tahrir, thinking about the various revolutions in terms of the aesthetics of them. You also mentioned, I mean, I'll throw this out, I mean, you can take this or not, but you have a chapter where you talk about the end of post-colonialism, and then you also talk about, separately, the end of post-coloniality, and then you sort of coin this notion of the post/colonial person. And folks who've had to go through the kind of canon of post-colonial theory will know that there are points where people are debating, should there be a hyphen between post-colonial, or should there not be a? But in a more serious sense, one of the debates always was, does post-colonialism, is that the description of a kind of linear or kind of historical moment, right? So is it the moment after colonialism? Is post-colonialism, and Ella Shohat, of course, was one of the people who first asked this question, is post-colonialism identical to anti-colonialism, right? I mean, is post-colonialism a kind of more institutional or institutionalized version of what happened after the anti-colonial movements? So I guess part of the question is, you know, the end of what specifically in terms of post-colonialism, post-coloniality. You talked a little bit already about this question of the regime, right, and the people want to work with the regime, and this notion of the regime of knowledge production. And I was thinking as I was reading the book, I think a particular group, one of the groups in Egypt, one of the kind of post-Tahrir groups that's specifically against the military, you know, sort of against military rule, had a document, I guess, where they basically said, we went to Tahrir, you know, we sort of threw out Mubarak, and then the real work began, and the real work is getting rid of what they call the regime of power. So, you know, I guess there's that question too, what precisely is that regime that, you know, needs to be overthrown? And, you know, I guess there's a sub-question too, if you look at Egypt and you look at, say, Bahrain or Syria, right, where the sort of things are still very much in the balance. You know, how to think those different sort of spaces together. You also mentioned already this question of Africa within the Arab Spring, which is something I'm particularly kind of interested in. Given that, you know, another way you can tell the story is there were a number of uprisings in North Africa, right? And there were also a number of uprisings throughout the African continent. You know, and then some others also, right? And that would be an equally possible geographic way of telling the story. And as somebody who works on Fanon, for example, you know, the part of his notion of the African Revolution was always that one of the things it would do would sort of get rid of this notion that there's sort of a North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, or as he called it, you know, white Africa, black Africa. So if that's also one of the things that we see potentially crumbling, or the potential for that to be one of the things we kind of take aim at. And the last thing I'll throw out, and we'll see where we go with other things, but I guess I want to ask the question, partly because one of the questions we've been discussing in the sort of the seminar at the Committee on Globalization and Social Change is the question of solidarity. Because one of the things I think that's so striking about the book is you talk about the way the world has been kind of decentered, right? The West, I think you say at one point the West has essentially ceased to exist in some ways. I mean, the concept of, obviously, still West East, but the sort of the concept of the West and the rest. So, you know, there's a question to me, and it's a question I've been thinking about really for quite a long time, about sort of what solidarity is, or what solidarity means in this particular moment. And there was a piece, I mean, it's in the book, but I mean, I remember a piece that you wrote for Al Jazeera, specifically talking about a couple of pieces that Zizek and Alain Badou had written, where they were kind of, oh, things are going bad, it looks like things may go Islamist, we can't necessarily support this. And, you know, the question of whether solidarity is contingent, right? Whether you look at these revolutions and say, this outcome looks promising, so therefore I'm in solidarity with it, or you say, this is, you know, I'm in solidarity with the notion of overthrowing the regime, and it's not contingent upon, you know, it looks like maybe the Muslim Brotherhood is sort of gaining, but it's not contingent on those sorts of issues. And that, you know, really struck me the way you sort of pulled that argument. So I would just be curious to hear, in the context that you set out, sort of what solidarity means, you know, at this moment.
Well, these are all wonderful questions, Tony. Thanks for reading the book. I've just had an interview with an Irish reporter who had also read this. These days, in the age of Facebook, you're grateful that people actually read books rather than learn something on the Facebook. I'm like you, asking very poignant and question more than anything else. I'm delighted that you have read the book and also prompted all of these questions. The link that you raised about between this and my previous book, The Brown Skin, White Mask, you're absolutely correct that Brown Skin, White Mask, which was kind of my homage to Fanon, obviously, was at a moment of desperation and anger and frustration of this combination of comprador intellectuals and native informers and fifth columnists who, if left to their own devices, they're quite ridiculous figures, but they also become very dangerous when push comes to shove, and what Chomsky calls manufacturing consent takes root, and they become handy. So you're correct in the sense that the general spirit governing the writing of that book is a Bush era book, as you remember when we had a conversation for Jadalia, is a result of 8 years of dark ages under Bush that we thought the world is coming to an end. Not that under Obama is any different. But in a sense, the engagement, the active engagement that is still, despite that spirit, as you recall, there is hope, there is determination and commitment to go after these people and name names and argue the argument and show what's what. So turning from that book to the Arab Spring, yes, there is an elation, there is a moment of uncensored elation about what is happening in the Arab world. And there is also a sense of kind of saying to the leaders of the brown skin, didn't I tell you so? Didn't I say so? There's that sense to it as well. But then, of course, I'm very much aware of all the traps that are ahead of us, and all the counter-revolutionary forces that are underway. And I mean, the simple fact that I refer to the Muslim Brotherhood are the beacons of neoliberalism, sort of carrying neoliberalism into Egyptian society and abashedly. Nevertheless, I remain, again, as I said, keep in mind that Hannah Arendt is the key figure in my thinking, that this notion of public space and the democratic will. And I recently came up with another term, revolutionary Gemeinschaft. Revolutionary Gemeinschaft is euphoric. There is a sudden sense of solidarity and camaraderie in Tahrir Square, for example. My friend and colleague Noha Rahman was telling me when she was in Tahrir Square, Muslim brothers and her, sort of what we call a secular woman, without veil and niqab or anything, holding hands and swearing that they would not leave until the moment that Hosni Mubarak leaves. That's kind of a momentary revolutionary Gemeinschaft. But in a recent conversation I had with a delegation of Egyptian revolutionaries coming to Colombia, my sense now is that they are concerned in Egypt, as you well know, about the possibility of Muslim Brotherhood. The parliament is under control of Muslim Brotherhood, and we don't know what will happen with the presidential election. Might write a constitution that is contrary to what we consider civil liberties and so forth. And my answer is that instead of waiting and hoping and wishing and all of that, what kind of a constitution will this particular parliament write? It's time to get busy with the transformation of that revolutionary Gemeinschaft into what I call 3 major voluntary associations: labor unions, women's rights organizations, and student assemblies, that indicates my preference for public space and societal formation rather than statism of the ruling regime. This idea has forced me to go back and reread my Bakunin, reread many of the early revolutionaries and the questions of state. I'm constitutionally suspicious of the state. I've always been suspicious of the state, but particularly under these circumstances. That chopping off of a head of a state, Ben Ali or Gaddafi, etc., when the regime of power, as you rightly said, is still intact and susceptible to manipulation of one sort or another, makes me very wary of statism and thinking about the state as a salvation, and more on the side of making sure that on the public space, formation of voluntary associations, particularly formation of labor unions, independent labor unions that can bring down the machinery of the state apparatus, is a key factor at this moment. Now, the question of aesthetics that you raised, yes, as you were talking, I was thinking of a chapter I wrote in a book a few years on Mahmoud on the question of post-coloniality and aesthetics, because in the act of the aesthetics, in the visual arts, performing arts, poetry, etc., which are so integral to these revolutionary uprisings, not only those that are composed on the Tahrir Square or Azadi Square and so forth, but also those that are that have preceded it. Now we're getting back and reading those poets and novelists and filmmakers and etc., and seeing what particular kind of dreams they had. So in the aesthetic act, there is a condition of post-coloniality. Now, as to what the difference that you pointed out between post-coloniality and post-colonialism and post/colonialism, you know, I'm part of the game, as you will know. But in the chapter that I call The End of Post-Coloniality, my point of contention is genealogy of ideology production. Okay? The genealogy of ideology production and the condition of coloniality, and in fact under the condition of anti-colonial uprisings. This genealogy leads, in my reading, to the formation of three modes of ideologies: militant ideologies, anti-colonial ideologies, ideologies that have been critical over the last 200 years in fighting against colonialism, new colonialism, etc. But in a way, in fact, they have led to the condition that now we are in, namely the rhetoric of, I would offer you the rhetoric of Muhammad Gaddafi as the supreme example of the end of that condition of ideology production. And this doesn't mean that the new emerging revolutions will not generate their own ideologies. So far as class, gender, and race exist, these ideologies, of course, inevitably will be generated. But my contention is that we are at a ground zero, that this episteme has exhausted itself. This is only about the colonial or the post-colonial world, that a specific mode of knowledge production was in operation. Again, I would roughly offer 200 years. So the British in India, French in North Africa, kind of a situation. The point that you raised about, Africa was extremely important. In fact, in the chapter that I call the liberation geography, the very term Arab Spring that limits our imagination and limits, in fact, the channeling of information and news and data that comes, as I said, from Senegal to Zimbabwe to Djibouti. There have been almost identical demonstrations, but they don't make it to the news, or they make it news haphazardly. They don't make it, they don't gel into, and in fact, some of the leading Arab scholars, my own colleagues, keep talking about the rejuvenation of the Arab Square, whereas I think the limitation of this to the Arab, whereas Iranians or Afghans or people in Senegal, as we saw recently, are very much part of this, requires a different geographical imagination. Obviously, there is a point to calling this Arab Spring, because after all, Al Jazeera is key, and Jadaliyah are two key factors in our reading and understanding of the Arab Spring, and also because of the transnational disposition of these revolutions. That is, as soon as Secretary Clinton wants to control what's happening in Tunisia, something pops up in Egypt. And as soon as, again, Secretary Clinton goes to Egypt and says, oh, you know, we are all for your revolution. After all, your army was instrumental in the success of your revolution. And so we are in with you in this revolution. Something happens in Bahrain and screws up the arrangement. Or something happens in Yemen. So there is something to be said about calling this the Arab Spring because of the transnational disposition of these factors. But then we run into other obstacles that then within, for example, these national uprisings, say, after Egypt, all the eyes were diverted to Syria. This has historical significance because of this, because of the importance of Egypt and Syria in the Arab world, intellectual importance, population importance, and so forth. But nevertheless, as Audio knows, the football event in Port Said and other parts of Egypt suddenly opened up a whole new vista of how we look at revolution. In inner space, that football, soccer, what do you call soccer, assumes a political significance. Not that it didn't have a political significance, but it assumed a new significance. I was just upstairs listening to a fantastic talk about a redefinition or reconceptualization of public space in Palestine by a wonderful architect that is your guest today here, Alessandro Petti. So these reconceptualizations of the space are, I think, very crucial. Now, in terms of solidarity, is a very good point. My sense of solidarity, which is, let me give you a specific example. There's a young Iranian revolutionary activist, a graduate student at Yale, who has gone to the Zuccotti Park over the last year and told the story of a political prisoner in Iran to New York activists in Zuccotti Park, and then listened to his story and asked that person in Zuccotti Park to prepare a poster with a picture of that Iranian political prisoner, and now he's preparing an exhibition of 99 of these posters in honor of the 99% movement. These are breaking down of the political and imaginative geographical boundaries that, to me, are potentially very revolutionary. And there are many psychological barriers that need to overcome. And I give you another example. This Egyptian delegation that came had a meeting with us at Columbia. One of them, a community activist, Russia was her name, and they too were very concerned about the Muslim Brotherhood taking over. And I asked her, why don't you go to a mosque and start organizing inside a mosque? She said, mosque? I said, yeah, why not mosque? Why aren't you Muslim? I said, well, I'm secular. I said, well, screw secular. You're a Muslim. You also invade the mosque. This mosque should become the extension of the public space, not the mosque coming and taking over the public space. So categories such as secular or religious need to be radically reconsidered in these circumstances, because we are not married to these concepts. We didn't invent them, we have nothing to do with them.
Can I just follow on that? Because I was thinking before when you mentioned the kind of revolutionary dimension, like this notion, you sort of mentioned the moment of sort of the member of the clan and someone who identifies secular and gets it together. And I was wondering, I mean, is that a notion of a in other words, is that what we would think of as kind of old school coalition politics, right? Where sort of in this moment you have sort of this and this combined, or is there a transformative?
Exactly.
It's almost to me the tension between, if you will, I mean, Fanon and Direct. I mean, like, is the public a kind of is revolution a kind of transformative moment?
It is a transformative. Yeah, it is a transformative. I don't quite know what you mean by Fanon and Arendt, because in Arendt there is also an element of transformation. But no, I mean it as there is no coalition, as you well know. Coalition between what? Yeah. You have an Egyptian academic, intellectual, a single mother, teaching in UC, system, going, leaving her kids with friends and family and going to join the revolution and getting beaten up in the process because she was thought to be Palestinian. Okay, and right now, for example, Bahraini revolutionary activists are denied access to Egypt because the security apparatus in Egypt is afraid of regional solidarity as well. So no, I mean it as a transformative, or the bedding of a new transformative period. Because coalitions, after all, you need political parties, you need specified ideologies, etc. And you don't have that. Now, I'm not a big fan of the new media, you know, wild one, this and that. Nor am I antiquarian and deny the significance of somebody like Wild One and Facebook and so forth. I simply, in a very simple, Georg kind of a thing, I look at Facebook as an extension of the web of affiliation, not as substitution for the web of affiliation. Yeah.
We're friends on Facebook, so we're pretty active.
Yeah, just I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on this notion of open revolution. I mean, how different is it from permanent revolution?
Yeah.
And what do you mean by it? Because, and I think along with that, I know this is a very hard question to ask you in the sense of getting a definitive answer, but to what degree do you see a new poetry of understanding coming out of what's going on? And what will its language look like? One moment in your argument, you seem to be saying it'll be a worldly cosmopolitan. You know, some of us, well, me anyway, are highly critical of the cosmopolitan term that's taking place. And we see it just as imperialist as... Sure. So I wonder how you see that, because I mean, obviously something is going on and you're picking up all of these kinds of things and trying to formulate them, and that's very, very difficult to do.
Yeah, excellent point. I'm happy you raised it. The question of cosmopolitan, I have to explain. I do at points explain it, not entirely in this book, in other works as well. That Timothy Brennan has a fantastic critique of the notion of cosmopolitanism, the way that, for example, Sheila bin Habib or others use it as, well, as Timothy Brennan rightly says, this cosmopolitanism is Americanism writ large. But I have a rather radically different conception of cosmopolitanism, and that is the retrieval of worldly maps that have been wiped out and mapped over by European imperialism. Best example that I can give you is great Spanish historian Amerigo Castro's book on the Spaniard. The book is called The Spaniards, in which he dismantles the notion of Europe as a myth and posits the Iberian Peninsula as a project. Basically, he was a linguist based on linguistic and archaeological and artistic and intellectual heritage. A world that is different and is actually decidedly syncretic, made of Christian, Jewish, and Islamic aspects and colorings and so forth. It is that specific syncretic civilization or culture or modus operandi of daily life in Spain, as, for example, articulated by Amerigo Castro, that I call cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan in the sense of existing but overshadowed, not by, oh yes, we're all, after all, the product of enlightenment, let's be happy and shake hand and go home. Another example is from, say, a few hundred years earlier, is Ibn Khaldun's conception of Mediterranean civilization and culture, which is made of Berber, Islamic, Christian, Jewish, etc. elements, and all predicated not on religious identification, but actual on navigational patterns within in the trade routes in the Mediterranean. I can give many other examples. When Al-Biruni wrote his book on India, again a different world existed. My conception of cosmopolitanism is, first of all, recognition of existing and lived worlds and worldliness prior to the European map. I refer you to the moment in Heart of Darkness when Marlowe is saying the fascination with the map, particularly the blank parts of the map waiting to be navigated. My argument is that blank part of the map is not blank, actually, is perfectly navigated, but it's just not seen by Marlowe. So from that, in fact, you're correct in connecting this with open-ended, which is, yes, open-ended is very much closer to permanent, and in fact, somewhere in the book, I suggest I'm trying to wed Hannah Arendt and Trotsky, Frida Kahlo notwithstanding. So to bring the two together, because in my reading of Arendt, the public space becomes open-ended. Multiple possibilities exist in it, and partially, again, my preference for open-ended is not against permanent, but against total revolution that is taking over the state, and everything will be fine and dandy. That I am historically and by disposition, historically given the history of our region, suspicious of the instant formation of the state as the panacea of everything that we face. I hope I partially answered.
Just one other kind of question. I mean, if this is the end of post-colonialism, what the hell's going to happen to post-colonial theory? aren't you writing yourself out of a job?
I don't want to get too biographical, Professor Harvey, but I have created enough trouble for my university that I have a very cozy and comfortable and productive space to create troubles with the next generation of my students. So no, I will not be writing myself out of that thing. As I said, I've been teaching. Arya took my post-colonial, and he came as an adamant anti-post-colonial theory person. But in my post-colonial theory, I read Das Kapital. So it's a different take on it. No, I mean, in many ways, you may consider, in fact, the Edward Said's Orientalism both the inaugural and the ending of post-colonialism, or you may consider the cul-de-sac of Gayatri Spivak's Candace of Autumn Speak, the end of post-colonialism, because the cul-de-sac that she creates at the end of that end, puts everybody out of the job. And in my judgment, in departments of English and comparative literature, not in revolutionary streets in Cairo or other places. What will happen, the paradox, as Tony just said, is in fact in the theoretical production itself that has always existed. But what comes after it is precisely the excitement of the terra incognita that we are. And because I'm very specific in the book that what I mean by it is a specific regime of ideology production that has come to an end as a proposition, which I think is perhaps plausible.
If I could just add, I mean, on behalf of English departments, maybe. But no, but I mean, also, I mean, there's an interesting, of course, institutional question in terms of post-colonial studies, but I mean, as somebody who's kind of weaned in post-colonial studies, I mean, it has always seemed like the majority of people who inhabit the field of post-colonial studies have, like, always already rejected it. Right? There's not a lot of people who embrace the notion. I mean, it's been kind of very problematic. And as someone who also spent a certain amount of time in Middle Eastern studies programs, that's been a major question as well, right? Where, for example, to think Palestine within post-colonial studies, or where to think, Syria for that matter. I mean, any of the mandates, sort of how to think the mandate. And so there's always been this kind of interesting lack of fit.
Yeah.
But I do want to ask you about the role of the critic in this. I mean, because the role of the critic,
yes.
I mean, kind of aesthetic criticism.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, there's a kind of slightly Adornian moment. I think you actually cited Adorno in the book, with a kind of Adornian moment, and
no, I do cite this. I don't know.
Just, I mean, thinking that, I mean, one of his kind of perpetual warnings was the notion of kind of criticism as affirmation, right? That when criticism turns into affirmation, that's when the sort of danger levels go on. Yeah. And in a sense, it's a somewhat affirmative moment, right? One looks at a certain situation. So I guess.
Well, there are a number of things. First of all, it's part of a defetishization of this thing called post-colonial, because it has become fetishized into something that it shouldn't. Number one. Number two, as I said, if we take two seminal texts of Said's Orientalism and Beatrice Vivac's Kendall Subalternism as two critical moments of post-coloniality. Within them, as you know, there is that paradox of beginning and end at the same time. Third, you just said it, is the question of Palestine in particular, that thumbs its nose at any idea of post-coloniality. And one major theme in this book is the question of the Arab Spring as the third, quote-unquote, the third intifada. The third intifada that everybody was waiting to happen. Would it happen? Would it not happen? Well, in fact, as you well know, people were anticipating, oh, it's going to be this summer that the third intifada will happen. It will happen. The third intifada had a moment of Hegelian Aufgehung, in these revolutions.
I'd like to open it up to audience. I don't know if you have any written questions, but there are enough, I think. Small number here, so I think actually we could just take questions directly from the floor now.
Yeah, but if you could use the mic, then it would be good for the video recording.
So, anybody want to ask some questions?
Are you all convinced?
You've solved it.
I won't use the mic, but maybe you can just repeat the question to the camera. I was curious about the tail end of your point about third intifada being a kind of new moment. I'm trying to understand your analysis of that. Are you saying intifada has begun and the Palestinian question will play out, or that it hasn't really begun and it's sort of up to us to figure out whether that's even possible in the current sort of political climate of the Palestinian question? So maybe you can just help us think that.
Yeah, the latter part of what you just said. In other words, in my reading, the question of Palestine is so definitive to the Arab Spring, to the Arab Revolution, so integral to it, that I have argued that the Arab Spring is the third intifada writ large, beyond the control of Israel or the United States or anything of that sort, is transnational. And the fact that it's no longer within any specific boundary, that as soon as you try to control it in one, it pops up in another. And simultaneously, if you spend any time in Palestinian refugee camps, anywhere in Lebanon, Syria, etc., you will know that this fantastic Hamdallah character, the Najl Ali creation, curses imperialism and Arab potentates almost in the same sentence. So the fact that we have this particular revolutionary moment from one end of the Arab world to the other, that is, again, in my reading of it, considering all the counter-revolutionary forces that are operative, are precisely that is both against domestic tyranny and against incorporation into this particular geopolitics of the region, that the United States military and economic and strategic interest in the region hinges on the state of Israel, and thus the interest of the state of Israel. So yes, in those specific terms, the third intifada has started. We are a year and a half, two into it. And what we saw last year, that Palestinians from Lebanon and Syria beginning to swarm back into their own land, was a momentary symbolic indication of it. And when the demonstrations that we saw in Egypt in front of the Israeli embassy was another indication of it. And the porous border at Rafah between Egypt and Gaza is another indication of it. And to me, it's just a matter of time. And precisely for that reason, the unfolding of these democratic uprisings, which by definition are chaotic and unpredictable, is the nightmare of Israel, because Israel cannot deal with anything but Arab potentates. And among the strategies that now they think will deal with this issue is the fabrication of the issue of the Iranian nuclear matter, that is more than anything else is a distraction. First, from ongoing the sort of non-existent peace process, so-called, and second, from the consequences of these Arab revolutions, and the consequences not even in the case scenario that you have a collective uprising against this colonial occupation, but the unpredictable nature of the situation in Egypt, in Syria, in any country. And as a result, we always make what seems to be the strange bedfellows between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Israel. None of those two countries wants to have a radical change in the region. Having Bashar al-Assad in Syria in power is good, not only for the Islamic Republic and Hezbollah, but also for Israel, because they know who they are dealing with. Whereas right now, it's not just Netanyahu that is in trouble. Hassan Nasrallah is in trouble. Hassan Nasrallah is in deep trouble. In 2006, Hassan Nasrallah was probably the most popular after Gamal Abdel Nasser in the Arab world. But today, in the aftermath of his actively siding with Bashar al-Assad, he's in deep trouble in the Arab world. Hamas has been far wiser in its dealings with the Arab Spring, sort of keeping relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran, but not, Khalid Mash'al goes to Tehran and in his face tells Khamenei that Mahmoud Abbas was correct in bidding for a statehood in the UN, contrary to Khamenei's wishes or intention. So as a result, the whole, as I say, the political DNA is beginning to change. And in that context, the status quo ante, and many of these countries, they're trying to pull the situation to a status quo ante and to the condition of war. Much of this warmongering between Israel and Islamic Republic of Iran is to generate a state of war, which is for them better than the actuality of war, both for the ruling regime in Iran and for Israel.
I think it's interesting that you end the book with a long quotation from an Israeli dissident group that suggests that this is just not an Arab spring.
Exactly.
Why did you do that?
Well, I remember last summer, as I was writing the book, I was also teaching a course on the Arab Spring, and I had a bet with my student that before the course was ended, the course was in July, we will have demonstrations in the streets of Tel Aviv. And for that, I had an entirely, how shall I say, streetwise intuition that there is a bloc party in the region. Sooner or later, Israelis want to be part of this bloc party. And before the semester ended, the so-called tent uprising, the tent movement began in Israel as well. I believe that it's impossible to think that 6-7 million Israelis entrapped within a large ghetto inside these walls want to be there and remain there and not to be part of this general collective euphoria uprising. The statement that I end with are obviously by progressive and Israelis, mostly from the Arab countries, originally, or their parentage. But by extension, I wanted to end on what Said calls a contrapuntal moment, that this is not something that is against Israel, is against this particular configuration of Israelis. And as a result, they must feel and they must be welcomed to imagine a future for themselves inside that general condition, rather than feel that this is at their expense. They need to overcome a psychological barrier as everybody else.
The other comments, yeah.
I just wonder, how do you see if the end of post-colonialism? I mean, post-colonialism, apart from being theory, is also part of the history of the Arab world. So how that end of post-colonialism is going to reflect or is going to be integrated in the arts of that part of the world?
Yeah, the art, first of all, let's put the art, I'll come back to art in a moment. You're correct that it's part of the history of the Arab world, you're absolutely correct, but it is precisely that particular episteme of history, that particular spectrum of history that I think has come to an end, which I offer it as an episteme. Okay, it has exhausted itself, doesn't have any more, if you would take the sort of Thomas Kuhn conception of paradigm, verb, it has been conjugated. There is no more possibility of conjugation. In art, I believe the episteme has collapsed, and I can offer Mona Hatoum's work, or Elias Salman's cinema, or Sanaa Ibrahim's novel, many works of fiction, poetry, cinema, art installations, as indices that in fact that moment of post-coloniality had been transgressed aesthetically, poetically, formatively, and the form had been destructed. If you look at, for example, again, because I just finished an essay on Elias Salman's cinema, his paramount on my mind. So historically, yes, this is a moment of historical recognition and historical consciousness. Historical consciousness on the model of what Gramsci talks about as to people coming to that moment. But aesthetically, in my opinion, the formal destruction, Adornian moment of formal destruction, has happened much earlier. But in, by and large, obscure works of art that not even in the Arab world are widely known.
First, thank you so much for the presentation. Open and get revolution, super interesting. My question is simple: I just curious what your comment to some countries which also kind of involved in this Arab Spring wave, but not have as radical change as Egypt or Syria, like Morocco or Algeria, don't even have like changed their constitution. And what do you comment on those countries?
Very good point. This is where what I said, that this conception of non-linear, that and also the side effects or catalytic effects of one or the other. One of the things that is very irksome to me is when talking about Libya, they say, oh, it's a tribal society, and Benghazi is this, and Tripoli is the other thing, which is, first of all, factually not correct. The second thing is the question of transnational impact, the synergy that exists among these, and the comparison with the 1848, which was, as you know, also called Spring of Europe, European Spring, is precisely that there are consequences from political to societal to artistic to epistemic, you name it, just moves on. In other societies that is not visible necessarily in the collapse of the political regime, or in Morocco, as you rightly said, there is a suggestion of a constitutional change, demonstrations kind of subside, but then demonstrations emerge because the underlying factors ranging from economic to deprivation to societal anomie to cultural alienation, okay? Cultural alienation, social anomie, political, economic factors. They keep feeding on each other. And here, the question of public perception, public awareness, again, that every evening imagine people get all on their, iPhones, etc., watching Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, or Al Arabiya, or Jadaliya for the more sort of academically inclined, are critical factors in creating that public space. And in that public space, I give you all Arabs participate, including those countries in which we have not seen revolutions yet. In July 2009, almost a month after the June 2009 post-presidential crisis in Iran, I was in a panel discussion with Marwan Bishara in his program Empire. This is July 2009. This is long before Muhammad Bouaziz's tragic suicide, in which I said, if I were in a position of authority anywhere, from Morocco to Syria, I would watch what is happening in Iran carefully. Because the demographic composition of Iran is almost identical with the demographic composition of the Arab world at large. Somewhere over 80% under the age of 40 and 50% under the age of 25. That young generation, just in and of itself, that is, or at least a significant component of it, is globally hooked and linked. And from that grand narrative to this specific news that the revolutionary activist, Bahraini revolutionary activist, was prevented from entering Egypt just a couple of weeks ago. That indicates that there are regional and transnational implications that will result not necessarily in one sort of revolution or coup or another, but transformations will happen regionally and in multiple ways that may not even be, immediately perceived, but nevertheless evident.
Any other questions? That makes some final comments.
That's much a comment, but one last question, and it's been bothering me, and it came up in terms of what you were just saying in this last exchange. I mean, is it worth, if we're thinking about this as kind of post-ideology in some way, like what do we mean by the left, like within the Arab Spring, in the sense that, one of the things it sounds like we're past, I mean, in some ways, if you're talking about Egypt, Syria, it's not so much post-colonialism as maybe post-Arab nationalism, post-Arabism, post-Nasserism. And, one of the elements of that was, Nasser in a sense was the left, but it was also the destruction of the left. And one could say from Nehru, different situations. So, one way to argue it, I suppose, would be that it's the return of the left, like a new generation of the left, there's an earlier generation of the decimated. But is that a valuable point of analysis?
Oh, very much so. Fawaz Tarabulsi, the distinguished Lebanese, which you guys interviewed, one of the best interviews of Fawaz, was just here for 2 days, and we met. No, it's a fantastic moment, not only for the left, I would say, for the larger spectrum, including American left. the European left, etc. I mean, these exchanges that we have had with Zizek, who might ultimately consider to be an ally, obviously, but there are points of differences, is a very critical moment. It's a critical moment that if you read people like Azmi Bashar, the senior Arab intellectuals left on the left, Azmi Bashar, Fawaz Tarablusi, Saad al-Azm, etc., they are shedding skin. Okay, it's a moment that they have to come to terms with the fact that what they consider to be mughawala, the line of resistance, namely Syria, is not. How long can you continue and to say, oh, the reports are exaggerated, the Saudis are giving the money, and the Qataris are doing that, and the Americans are doing the other thing. At the end of the day, the fact is that it's a bloody, murderous ruling regime. And that is forcing people to reconceptualize. No doubt that there are resistances, and there are doubts, and there are suspicions, and rightly so, that people are resisting on the left to be on the bandwagon. Oh, fantastic Arab Spring, let's go for it. That, I think, is a healthy resistance. It's a very good resistance, because they dig out, for example, the discrepancy of data that comes out of Syria. It's very, I mean, look at Bassam's own position that has been fluctuating, because he is a critical thinker and goes with the events. So in the long run, I think not only for the Arab left, but for left in general, European left, the American left, is a moment of rebirth, of conceptualization. And in fact, in a way, that book might be, in my own estimation, is my way of joining a left rethinking of where do we stand and why. And for that, we need to stick our neck out and say, well, here we stand, and these are our reasons. So the reasons can be shut down, the history can be shut down, and we move on. And I don't believe in the recent history over the last 50 years, certainly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have had this critical moment in the Arab and Muslim left to think critically where historically we stand, what are our positions vis-a-vis these revolutions, and many of our fault lines, such as Islamophobia, that has been endemic on the left, is coming to the fore, and we need to deal with it. But again, I look at it, as you said in your first point, Tony, in a very positive, it's a very positive, good karma to this moment.
Well, at this point then, there being good karma, maybe we should close this and have conversations outside. And I want to thank you both very, very, very much. So thank you.